In this and the following set of lessons, we'll be tackling some questions about cells. What are cells? How do cells get energy? Why are cells so small? How do cells maintain themselves? What are the common features of all cells? And how can a living thing be composed of non-living parts? For the first question, we'll just remind ourselves that cells are the smallest things on Earth that have all of the characteristics on this list. So cells are the smallest fundamental units of life. And as such, they are responsible for that amazing transition from a lifeless planet to a planet with life. It was the appearance of the first cells that triggered the colonization of our planet with living things. In this set of lessons, we'll be focusing on a bacteria cell. It is the smallest and simplest kind of cell, but it illustrates lots of properties that all cells have. And in this particular lesson, we're going to focus on the cell membrane, the boundary of the cell. Now, the cell membrane is a flexible barrier that keeps the cell's contents together so that life-sustaining molecular interactions can occur. Remember, we're calling this the chemistry of life that occurs in the fluid within the cell. As Dutrochet argued, that cells take in nutrients and export waste, and something fascinating happens inside the cell, the chemistry of life. The cell membrane, then, is this boundary that keeps all of those molecular interactions together. The cell wall is a more rigid protective layer. Only some cells have a cell wall. Animal cells do not have a cell wall. Plant cells do have a cell wall, and many bacteria have cell walls. In bacteria, scientists can differentiate different kinds of bacteria depending on how they stain, whether certain chemicals will stain the bacteria or not. That stain can distinguish between different kinds of cell walls that bacteria construct, but we're not going to concern ourselves anymore with the cell walls of bacteria. Now, in a single-celled organism, the membrane defines the boundary of the self. So all living things have a boundary, the self versus the outside environment. And animals need food and produce waste because their cells need food and produce waste. And bacteria do the same. So if we think about this elephant here, it's taking in food, right? One of the reasons animals have to eat is because cells need nutrients. And the reason that animals produce waste, here the poop, but also the pee and just exhaling carbon dioxide, that's because cells produce waste. So we can start to make this connection that cells are living units, and as such they're importing nutrients and exporting waste. And it's no accident then that animals and plants and all multicellular organisms do the same thing. They do it because they are made of cells that are doing it. Now, the cell membrane regulates the flow of materials into and out of the cell. For instance, the food that's going to be imported into the cell is a source of energy and building supplies. Well, the cell membrane is going to be regulating the transport of food into the cell. And likewise, waste must be removed because it interferes with the chemistry that sustains life. Again, the cell membrane is going to be controlling the export of unneeded molecules. You don't want to allow the waste molecules to build up in the cell because that interferes with the chemistry of life. We've seen in an earlier lesson that cell membranes are composed of molecules called lipids, and here we have the lipid bilayer. And recall the tails of the lipids are fat molecules, and they like to stick together. The heads of the lipid molecules are on either side of the membrane. So we have a stable but flexible boundary, the cell membrane, made of two layers of lipid molecules. Now, as it turns out, if the cell membrane were composed of lipids only, as shown in this picture, large food molecules would have difficulty entering the cell. So this is a pretty tight boundary here. Now, small molecules like oxygen and water can make it through the lipid bilayer, but large molecules, food molecules, important molecules like glucose, they can't cross that lipid boundary very easily. And so if the cell's going to import food, it's going to have some way of getting larger molecules through the membrane into the cytoplasm inside the cell. This is a more realistic picture of the cell membrane. Here we see the lipid bilayer, but inserted into the membrane are all kinds of other molecules, large proteins, for example. So we want to think of the membrane of the cell as this flexible barrier, this flexible lipid bilayer, but it's got all kinds of other important molecules embedded within the membrane. And these different kinds of molecules, they might be large proteins, they have different tasks. And these proteins are built by the cell, and we'll figure out how that happens in later lessons, but these proteins are inserted into the membrane, and then they can do particular tasks. So this green protein is in charge of moving this molecule across the membrane. This orange one is going to take this different molecule and bring it into the cell. This one's going to do some chemical reaction near the membrane, and this protein maybe is going to anchor the cell to another cell if this were a multi-celled creature. So the proteins control the flow of materials into and out of the cell, as well as helping cells connect if it's a multi-celled organism. If we just take a look at the ones involved in food, so proteins are going to assist in the transportation of food into the cell and waste out of the cell. And so the activity of these proteins makes the membrane selectively permeable. That's a technical term, meaning that the membrane only allows certain molecules to enter and exit the cell, depending on the proteins that are specialized to operate on those molecules. So there are thousands of different kinds of proteins within the cell, and many of them are on the cell membrane, and each has a specific job to do, and together they perform the chemistry of life. So we're going to have proteins on the surface, on the membrane of the cell, that are going to be bringing important molecules into the cell and taking waste out, and then we're going to have a whole team of protein, thousands of different proteins that are doing all kinds of chemistry inside the cell to sustain the cell's life. So in this lesson then, we've begun to break down the bacteria cell, figure out how it works. We started with the cell membrane. So bacteria cells, like all cells, have to import some source of energy and building materials in order to keep the cell alive. And the cell membrane is going to regulate the flow of materials in as well as the waste out of the cell. And what's actually doing that are proteins embedded in the cell membrane.